I hope that this promising project will revive Cordoba's great legacy, Cordoba, the symbol of intellectual brilliance, creativity, pluralism and openness, Cordoba, the crossroad between East and West, the great Muslim European metropolis. When Europe was still gripped by the mania of intolerance and fanaticism, hundreds of schools of thought and ideas coexisted within Cordoba. The theologian coexisted with the scientist, the jurist with the poet, the philosopher with the artist, along with an astonishing array of creeds and races. In these times of tension and turmoil, the need to revive Cordoba's great legacy has never been greater. I hope that this promising project will make a serious contribution to a rigid debate on history and identity, past and present. I hope that it would inject a much needed dose of objectivity, balance and depth to this rigid debate. I know you want to know more about this promising project, so without further ado, I shall invite you to watch this trailer on the Cordoba Foundation. It's there. Sorry, after that. Okay. Should we just relax?
The Cordoba Foundation. Are the East and West destined to clash? The Cordoba Foundation works to prove that a supposedly imminent confrontation between the Western world and the Muslim world is neither inevitable nor necessary.
The Cordoba Foundation was set up to bridge cultures and civilizations in the spirit of the city that continues to offer a true model of prosperity, advancement and peace within the context of human interaction, exchange and collaboration. The spirit of Cordoba is evoked when minds clash and societies become embroiled in disputes. The city and civilization of Cordoba remains living evidence of the ability of minds and inspirations to meet, collaborate and strive for the common goal of advancement and success.
Established in 2005, the Cordoba Foundation is an independent research and public relations organisation and is located in Westminster, in the heart of London's cosmopolitan capital city. The aims of the Cordoba Foundation: to promote dialogue and the culture of peaceful coexistence, to work with decision-making circles for better understanding and clearer comprehension of intercommunal and interreligious issues in Britain, across Europe and beyond, to provide a new and unique standard of information, allowing decisions and policies to be established upon proper basis and efficient consultation. What we do: structured consultation and advisory services, face-to-face interaction with decision-makers and scholars, in-house research and research support on key issues, workshops, seminars and roundtables on pressing issues including conflict resolution, training and capacity building. All of expertise, sound knowledge and awareness. In the spirit of mutual recognition of the needs and sensitivities of respective parties. Publish a bi-monthly periodical. Arches. Resource website.
At the Cordoba Foundation, we view research and studies as crucial to efforts at bridging differences, mending divisions, and finding common grounds amongst people and civilizations. The world is not on a collision course as some would like us to believe. God's planet is big enough for us all and is in need of our collective ingenuity, creativity, and endeavour.
In dialogue. To contact the Cordoba Foundation, please call our office in London or visit our website for more details on www.thecordobafoundation.com.
And now on to Mr. Ismail Patel, one of the directors of Islam Expo. Please give him a warm welcome.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Jazakallah khair for that. First and foremost, thank you very much for attending Islam Expo and in particularly the launch of Cordoba Foundation. As you know, the logo for Islam Expo is promoting dialogue and understanding, and I can see the extension from that, the work of the Cordoba Foundation. Really, in essence, there are people who are advocating a clash of civilization, and those that are taking this path really need to be checked. This is a great challenge, and Cordoba Foundation should be really congratulated and supported in this infancy that they managed to nullify, if not really make them totally insignificant in the next few months, if not years to come. Because if they do take the upper hand, unfortunately, the consequences could be quite catastrophic. As we have seen in Europe 70, 80 years ago, what happened to the Jewish community, it can happen to another community in Britain as well. It is something that we need to rise up to. Challenges are there for those with mental capabilities and also understanding to create opportunities from. And therefore, I think Cordoba Foundation must be really congratulated on this. And through them, we hope that they'll be able to produce documents which can then be put forward to the government, because poor knowledge really ends up in bad policies, and bad policies really means disasters for the rest of the community. Good information, good knowledge, which we hope Cordoba Foundation can produce, can then be translated into sound policies. Policies will then go towards trying to make each and every members of this great country we live in equal and respectable to each other. And at that note, I'd like to end and ask you next speakers to come in. Jazakallah khairan, and we hope that we'll join in, and not only for today, but for future years be with you. Jazakallah.
Thank you. Our next speaker is the man behind the project, Mr. Anas Al-Takriti. Let me just say a few words about Anas. I'm sure you recognize Anas as one of the prominent figures on the British Muslim scene. Anas Al-Takriti was a lecturer in translation and interpreting studies at Leeds University since 1995 and at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh between 2000 and 2003. His main activities, however, have been in the public forum, campaigning throughout Britain's Muslim community for more involvement and better engagement with the wider British society, and efficient and constructive role on the British political process. He is renowned for leading various anti-war campaigns and also noted for his efforts to help negotiate the release of British hostage Norman Campbell, who we have with us today, and his fellow Christian peacemakers. Please give him a warm welcome.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of our Lord Almighty, the most gracious, the most merciful. Chair, or chairess is it? I think it's chair. And our eminent guests, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you all. Thank you very, very much for coming today to the launch of the Cordoba Foundation. I think that Ismail Patel said something there which basically forms the philosophy behind this project. Bad policy is based upon bad information. The philosophy is, or the idea is, you provide a better set or a better collection of information, and hopefully the policy that will follow will become that much better. We live in a very difficult world. We live in extremely challenging times. However, we must never ever be swayed by the argument that we are on collision course. We must never ever buy into the argument that there is no way out. We must never ever be convinced of the statement that Muslims have to either desert their fundamental principles or their ideals in order to melt or to integrate or to become one with a modern society such as ours here in Britain. We must never, ever buy into that. And for one reason, not just because I say so, but also because we have, in not so ancient history, we have the example from which I took the name Cordoba, Cordoba in Arabic, in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews, people of all denominations, of all sectors, of all kinds, of all talents, of all skills, came and discussed. They talked. They addressed their concerns. They aired their grievances. They talked about their opinions on various matters, whether it be on art, philosophy, on science, on various matters relating to the universe and the cosmos, on doctrines, on dogma, on belief. And they came to an agreement that whilst they will each remain where they are in terms of what they believe in, and they will respect each other for that, but they will continue the process of dialogue. And all that, not within the realms merely of tolerance. Tolerance is a word that we've been using as a society for far too long, and I personally have to say that I don't like that word very much. Tolerance is when I have a neighbor that bothers me and I don't like very much, but I put up with that neighbor. It's not a matter of putting up with each other. It's a matter of whether we can arrive at a juncture where we can embrace our differences, where we can celebrate the fact that we are different, where we feed from one another, from where we come from. We come from a variety of backgrounds, cultural, religious, ethnic, all sorts. And for that, we become that much richer and that much better. The Cordoba Foundation hopefully will push forward and promote further the cycle of dialogue. And dialogue not because we want one party or another to compromise on its fundamental beliefs, but because we think that with people being quite steadfast in what they believe in their ideals and in their values, they could still be at one. And they could still live side by side and create a better community, a better society, and a better country for that. Thank you very much once again for coming today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anas, for your inspiring words. We have quite a lineup of speakers with us today, and we're really spoiled for choice. We shall begin with Professor Tariq Ramadan. Professor Tariq Ramadan, as you may know, has taught Islamic studies and philosophy as a professor at Freiburg University in Switzerland for many years. He is currently a visiting fellow at Oxford St. Anthony's College. He is active as an academic, lecturing extensively throughout the world on ethics of citizenship, social justice, and dialogue between civilizations. Very fittingly, he has kindly agreed to speak to us today on the topic of roots of civilizational dialogue in Britain and Europe. It gives me great pleasure to announce Professor Tariq Ramadan.
أعوذ من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I think it's important what we heard right now and to come back to the roots of the European civilization, speaking about Cordoba and speaking about this past and speaking about the fact that very often our understanding of what Europe or the Europe identity or the Europe conscience and the European civilization or even the Western civilization has been built, in which way we have to refer. I think that we are today experiencing something which is really important. When you listen to some of the discourses coming from some intellectuals throughout Europe, not only in Denmark recently after the cartoons issue, but in France, in this country, in Britain, when you have people rereading the past to put the Muslims outside the reality of a civilization, saying, for example, what are the 6 main values, or British values, or European values? And one of these values is, which is strange, by the way, I didn't know that it was a value, but saying Christianity. As if this is Britain, and then what is coming from not being Christian is alien to the British conscience and the British identity. Or, as it was not in the past, we have to try to find a way to deal with it in the present. So, rereading the past. Recently in France, one of the great historians coming saying, proud to be French. And what is the French civilization? Greco-Roman, Christian, Judeo-Christian, that's it. So the Muslim coming now should know what are our roots in order to know how to integrate, know who we are in order to be among us. But in fact, who we are is a reconstruction of the past, saying this is what we and who we are. And I think it's important coming from a foundation saying, no, that's wrong. The starting point of the discussion is in fact promoting self-ignorance. Because at the end, what is really important is not to speak about a dialogue between civilizations. It's to speak about a civilization knowing oneself, knowing what is this civilization. When today we speak about the Western civilization, and as if we Muslims, we are entering a dialogue between civilizations, we are accepting something which is a wrong prerequisite, which is Islam is outside this civilization. So we are coming with an outside civilization talking to the Western civilization. It's wrong. The Western civilization is not built on Greek or Roman Judeo-Christian roots, but Islam was part of it from the very beginning. So what we are, and I think that this is behind the whole story, is to reconcile the Western civilization with itself, to know what are the roots, what are we speaking about. We have now in our curriculum, in the way we are teaching history throughout Europe, something which is a very, very negative reality, which is a selective memory. So tell me how you read the past, I will know how you understand the present. And as you have a very reductive way to think about the past, you have a very selective way to deal with the present. So you Muslims should integrate something which is not yours. Why? Because our past is not with you, and it's wrong. Dealing, for example, with the Arabs and the Muslims and saying, for example, that they were only translators conveying the deep philosophical message of the Greek, it's wrong. They were not only translators. All the people during the Middle Ages who were just reading Aristotle, they were not reading the true Aristotle. They were reading Aristotle reread by Ibn Rushd, Averroes. So it's not the real Aristotle or the genuine message or thoughts. It was something which he was commenting, he was analyzing, he was criticizing. So it's something which is really important. So we know about this. We know about the philosophy, and we know, and mainly the people are always speaking about, Ibn Rushd. When the people don't know about the true contribution of the European Muslims to the European conscience, to the European identity, the only name they can just mention is Ibn Rushd, Averroes, as if it shows that they know something. In fact, when you come to philosophy, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali is someone who was really important with all the philosophy of doubt. So this is Descartes influenced by the deep medieval philosophy, was connected to Abu Hamid al-Ghazali and his thoughts during the 12th century. We don't know about this. So you can get a PhD in philosophy in Europe without having read one sentence of the Islamic philosophy or the Muslim philosophers, which is just incredible. It's really a reduction of the past. We know about the science, and this is presented here, and we have to promote this again, the contributions of the Muslims in this field. We don't speak about the legal contribution. At the end of the day, if we don't know that the Shatibi, who is one who is promoting the school of Madrasat al-Maqasid, which is the objectives, was a European. And he was not only dealing with philosophy, he was not, in fact, he was dealing with legal contribution. And you know what? Something which is really interesting. One of the great current philosophers based in Europe, Alain de Libera, specialist in the medieval thought, you know what he's saying? Exactly the opposite of what is said in the mainstream media and even among Muslims. He was saying, you know, there is something in the legal Islamic tradition, something which was rooted in the tradition, which is the distinction between two fields. When you deal with Allah, when you deal with God, you have to do but what is written. But when you deal with human being, interpersonal relations, you can do everything but not what is forbidden. So it's two methodologies. So we are distinguishing two methodologies. It's the same source, but two ways to deal with our rules. And you know what he's saying? This was the great influence from the legal Muslim scholars, the Muslim scholar working in the legal field to help the Christian tradition to go towards something that they call today secularism. Exactly the opposite of what we are saying. It's as if we don't know how to deal with rationality and with dogma, which is not the case. If we come back to the roots of the legal Islamic tradition, there is something which is a very interesting way to deal with two different spheres. And we know that anyone who is dealing with al-mu'amalat, wal-ibadat, the worship field, the creed, and what we are, or al-aqidah, and when we deal with the social affairs, there are two different methodologies. We know that. We know that this is rooted in our tradition. To listen to people now coming to us, telling us, you have to distinguish. Look, the problem is our own ignorance about our own tradition. And I think it's really important also with this foundation to say, okay, if we are true Europeans, come back to this tradition because this has nurtured the European civilization and the Western civilization. It's part of our dialogue. But you cannot dialogue with a civilization or within a civilization if you are self-ignorant, if you don't know who you are. So this is the problem, that the great problem that we have with European Muslims, they are saying, yes, we contribute a lot, but we don't know exactly how and when and with what. So we know that it was science. We know that it was some philosophical ideas. Come, this is something which is serious because it's the future. Know your past in order to build your future. I think it's really important. We know that about the legal system. So very quickly, I think that at the end of the day, it's not the Muslims dealing with the West. It's the West dialoguing with itself. It's an intra-civilizational dialogue that we are promoting. This new us that I'm speaking about is really to say, look, there is something which is a selective approach towards our history. And you know, when you come to the verse of the Quran, and I totally agree with what you said, tolerance is the wrong concept. In fact, the real concept is respect. Toleration or tolerance, within this term, there is something which is, the root of the term is to suffer the presence of to suffer. I suffer your presence. I don't like it, but I cannot do anything against it. This is a kind of to look down at people. Respect is something which is totally different, because you can tolerate me by ignoring me, but you cannot respect me by ignoring me. You have to know me. Respect is to know me and to deal with me on an equal footing. To tolerate me could be I ignore you. I suffer your presence. So be on the margin. We are speaking about respect because ta'aruf is at that level. But look at something which is really important in the verse. يا أيها الناس إن خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا. We made you nations and tribes in order for you to know each other. There is something which is really important. If you want to get that level, to know each other, nations and tribes to know each other, there is something which is implicit. To get that level of dialogue with the other, at least you have to know yourself. To know each other between nations and tribes. But implicitly, the message of the verse is know yourself. The problem we have in the West is that we don't know ourselves. There is something which is this selective memory. So let us, as European Muslims, as British Muslims, come to the true dialogue, which is to reconcile the Western civilizations with all its past, with all its contributors. And it comes to coming to this Cordoba period of time, this presence of Muslims in different areas, and to come to this and to promote an intra-civilizational dialogue. I'm sorry, I'm not talking to the West. I'm a Westerner talking from within the West with my fellow Westerners. And I want them to understand that I'm part of this we that they are speaking about. I am this we. I'm a Westerner. I'm a Muslim. And what I want you is not to make Westerner, the Western history, something which was not the reality. Western history is all this together. Philosophy, legal tradition, and Islam is part of it. Islam was a European religion. It is a Western religion. It's going to remain for now and for the future a European, a Western reality. But we have to reconcile the West with its own. Two last points. We don't have to be naive. To educate, to come with this perception of the past, is something which is an ideological stand. I don't think that the people who were and still are selective with the past are totally doing it out of ignorance. Yes, we have people who are ignorant, but we are dealing now with a political decision. This political decision, it's not by accident that now the far-right parties or the discourse coming mainstream now are just pushing this, you Muslim, you outside our reality. It's a political decision. It's an ideology to put us outside. So the way is to be aware of that, to say that we are not playing with ignorance. Some of the people who are doing this are not ignorant, and the people who are promoting this us versus them, they are not ignorant. So it's an educational decision to deal with a political stand, an ideological stand, which is to reconcile the West with its own values, its own contributors, its own past. I really think that we have to be aware of that there are people playing with this, using this, instrumentalizing the whole binary vision, us versus them. I think that we have to be aware that this is not acceptable. So a political stand to promote a better educational program, curriculums in our schools. The last point here is, once again, because I really think it's important not to be naive on this, I don't think that the fact we don't have a dialogue is only based on ignorance. Ignorance is one aspect, but not only. So the people who are naive think, oh, it's all about ignorance, we are not going that. I think that we have to be very, very, very cautious not to go to that direction, because it's a political decision, an ideological decision to deal with your own past. It's the same in the Islamic majority country. That's it. It's a decision. So some are following, some are criticizing. We should be critical in order to promote reconciliation. So it's an ideology of reconciliation when people are spreading an ideology of fear and division. The last point is really Cordoba is doing, the foundation is working in that direction, which is, alhamdulillah, very good. But there is one main field which is really important. I met some years ago Shabir Mansour in California. He was trying to do something which was really important, giving another vision of history from an American viewpoint, saying we need multiple viewpoints in order to have a more objective perception of the past with multiple contributions. And I think that today we are not going to win this together for the future if we are not teaching in our schools, in the mainstream school system, in the mainstream curriculum, something which is inclusiveness, something which is what is this European past, who are the contributors in philosophy, in science, in the legal system. I think that we need to give value to this past and to do something which is really important. Europe have changed. You have now memories, not only one memory, which is the memory of the white indigenous British. No, memories. The Pakistani memory is part of it now. The Turkish memory is part of it now. So we need to integrate this in our curriculum, because this recognition that this past, these memories are our history, could help us to build this history of memories and to build our future. What we are witnessing in some countries is a competition of memories. We need an objective history of memories. This is the way we can reconcile ourselves. At the end of the day, it's the citizens' business. It's foundation, it's the civil society doing something about it. But with the facilitating process of the governments, this is why we have to address this. To our governments, you have to do something about our curriculum. You have to do something about our past, our memory. If we are not doing this, we are accepting something which is an ideological division, which is not helping to a true intra-civilizational process or dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ramadan, for a very insightful presentation. Our next speaker needs no introduction, really. Professor John Esposito is University Professor of Religion and International Affairs and the founding director of the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at George Washington University. He is editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World, editor of the Oxford History of Islam, and the author of numerous books, including Unholy War, Terror in the Name of Islam, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, and most recently, the Oxford Dictionary of Islam. Professor Esposito has traveled from the United States, to participate in Islam Expo and has kindly agreed to honor us with his presence to speak on the topic of meeting of civilizations from clash to communion. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. As some of you may know, it's not that common in the UK with these BlackBerries. You can do all your email, and you probably saw me doing this on the stage. That is not because, as my wife will sometimes say, that I'm addicted to it. It's because I'm monitoring the kinds of mail I'm getting in reaction to the piece I did in The Guardian. And I was debating whether I would read one or two of them to you. The initial ones were positive. They are now piling on the fanatics, but that's another story, who the fanatics are. But it's amazing. I was just reading a few of them there. It's always nice to see people who talk about how other people hate and say it themselves in such hateful terms. The only thing you can feel good about is that if they're doing it, they may have a stroke. No, I'm going to follow up on some of what Tariq has said, and I'm going to do it in my own particular way, and I want to just lend a little bit of a background. I think that the starting of this foundation is critical because the fact is that there are those who are attempting to provoke a clash. And it's not just governments, and it's not just the West. As we all know, it also is Muslim extremists. The problem is we have people on both sides that want to provoke a clash and then indeed foster a clash of cultures. And the question is whether or not we who are in a majority, whoever we are, whether we're Muslim or non-Muslim, whether we're believers or not, are going to do something about it. I mean, that's the real issue. But I think that in order to understand how we got here, we need to know just a little bit about where this came from. For many, certainly in America, but also in the West, if you wanted to kind of tick off very quickly their image, not only of Muslim extremism, but regrettably of Islam itself, because they come to equate Muslim extremism with Islam, you start with the Iranian Revolution and the threat throughout the 1980s of the export of the revolution. And some of you are too young to remember that when Khomeini spoke, the world listened. And for the 1980s, the big concern was, where would that export turn up? If an Iranian delegation appeared in Nicaragua, there was a concern that they were there to promote revolution. You also have to keep in mind the fall of the Soviet Union and then the concern with what would be the next global threat. People looked at whether it would be the US and the EU in rivalry, whether it be the US and Japan in rivalry, but Islam offered a global ideological alternative, and indeed some of the political events that were going on, the Iranian Revolution, the taking of hostages, kidnappings, blowing up of embassies played into that. Saddam Hussein stoked the fires, and then we come up with 9/11 and 7/7, and that takes the threat from out there to here, as it were. And that's the way it's perceived. Suddenly we're talking about a threat that goes in the Muslim world from Morocco to Indonesia, but also in the West, from New York and Washington to Madrid and London. As a result, you find people as long ago as 10 or 15 years ago, but particularly today, repeating the same kind of triple threat. That what we're talking about is an age-old conflict, and that it is political, it is civilizational, and it is demographic. And that demographic threat has been resurrected. If you look at the Guardian piece, I talk about a prominent writer, and I quote what he said. In fact, it's Pat Buchanan, who's an American who had written a piece 10 years ago, but quoting, I couldn't get into this because I'm only allowed so many words, Hilaire Belloc, who was British and who 60 years ago talked about the potential threat of Islam, quoting it with a kind of saying how Belloc was kind of prescient. So I think that background becomes important to understanding where we are. But note what happens then. We wind up seeing Islam through a distorted lens because we see Islam, the religion of the majority, through the acts of a minority. And as a result, Islam gets equated with extremism and terrorism. And 9/11, 7/7 reinforced that. Now the question is this the only option? And if not, what is the option? Well, to borrow a phrase that is used a good deal in the UK, but also in other parts of the world, one talks about winning the minds and hearts. But I think that winning the minds and hearts is, in fact, a two-way street. It's not just something that Western governments have to engage in. It's something that Muslims have to engage in, whether one likes it or not. I didn't necessarily say Muslim governments because it all depends on the Muslim governments. But it is a two-way street. In fact, each has to attempt to engage in what public diplomacy is about. It's public relations. So what do we say to Britain and the US? You need to communicate, or what they say is we need to communicate better who we are, what we stand for, okay? It's also what we do. That's the second part. What are our policies and our actions? But this is also what is incumbent upon Muslims, to communicate more and more, and this is what Islam Expo, it seems to me, is so important for, and the Cordoba Foundation is so important for. What Muslims need to do more and more is to communicate who they are, what Islam is about, and what they stand for and what their policies and actions stand for. I cannot tell you how often people say to me, ask me when I speak publicly almost every time, and indeed on some of the emails I was getting today. One of the first indictments of Muslims is they slip into equating Islam with the acts of extremists. B, to say, where are they denouncing the terrorism? Why don't they denounce it? And can we blame them? The media doesn't cover it. The statements are all over the internet, but it's not covered. A New York Times reporter, who's a former Middle East expert, wrote a piece 4 or 5 months ago in which he basically himself said the same thing, when in fact he had to know better not only as an expert, but an expert who has researches. In other words, saying, even until now, where are the Arabs and Muslims denouncing extremism, fighting extremism? So I think that at the heart of it is a two-way street that has to deal with winning the minds and hearts of, if you will, the other to convince the other that they're not other. We all need to convince ourselves that we're part of the same mosaic. Years ago when I wrote Islamic Threat, I used what is not good grammar in English and said, Muslims are us. Now that was true 10, 15 years ago, and it's certainly even more true today. But getting that across, and I think the way Tariq approaches things is really important, because it's not saying to people, look, recognize me. It's saying, I am a Westerner. It's not saying to people, empower me and tell me that I'm accepted as a Westerner. It's the same as talking about women's empowerment. Women's empowerment is not about women asking the good old boys, men, please empower me, please recognize my rights. Because if you're asking somebody else to empower you, there's a problem. If they empower you, they can also take it away. You're saying you don't have that natural born right, that powerful right. Now, I think that Cordoba is a very good name to take. But let me say why I think it's important, and I want to push it just a stage more in the way I would approach it. Cordoba is a symbol of the convivencia that existed in Andalusia and in Cordoba, which is a living together. It's a coming together, okay? But the old Cordoba of centuries ago needs to be replaced by the new Cordoba. The fact is the world has changed since that time. And even our notion of living together has to go beyond it. That Cordoba, which was so far ahead of its time, was still basically a living together of, if you will, the elites. Our concern in our societies is that it has to trickle down as well as trickle up. It cannot simply be an elite phenomenon because so many of us and so many of our families live in different stratas of society. And the way in which we understand each other is not by, yes, experts' influence, but the way in which societies get transformed, I believe, is from below. The way in which people come to respect Muslims and vice versa is if you work together, you meet each other, you work in the same neighborhoods, you go to the same parents' teaching, and then if people hear something about your religion, they say, wait a second, I know so-and-so, they're a good person. Now, either they're a good person and their religion is not good, but that seems like a contradiction. Once we come to respect each other as human beings, I think we can move a little better. Sometimes when it's top down, there's a problem. When it's top down, we get caught only in foreign policy. When it's top down in theological discussion, we start with, of course, the brilliant approach that some of my Muslim friends take, which is to walk up to a Christian and say, the Trinity is stupid. Let me tell you why Islam has the right idea. It's the terrific approach to dialogue. It's the dialogue of slapping. And then you have, of course, the Christian who comes and says, well, you have a barbarian religion, and the best way to improve it is X. The reality of it is that we need to have this kind of multiple approach to what we're talking about. Because today we live truly in a global world, in a global world order. We're dealing with global communications. What does this mean concretely? Number one, yes, we have to talk about theologically what we share. We need to not only assert, but remind people that there is a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. When I studied Islam, Islam was put with Hinduism and Buddhism. And then you had Judeo-Christian. That immediately says foreign, you see. Takes all Western roots out. Now, the problem was many Muslims at that time also liked that in a weird kind of way because they didn't want to have anything to do with the West. Not too smart, but that's okay. Rather than saying a lot of your roots come from us, it was almost like, since I don't like you, I don't want to be with you. Well, it comes back to haunt you. That's one. Two, but we also have to realize and recognize what we all share in common. What do we share in common? Not just the other. What do we share in common? We all have exclusivist theologies. I like you, but you're going to hell. And then we have our theologies of hate. You see? The difference between somebody who follows a theology of hate and an exclusivist theology is people who follow an exclusivist theology say, I love you, you're going to hell, but they don't feel an obligation to send you to hell. They'll leave it to God. They're willing to at least do that. Okay. But we have to recognize we all have to deal with the implications of exclusivist theologies because they not only affect our relationship with other believers of other faiths, they work internally. When you call somebody a non-believer, if you're a Christian, or when you say somebody is kufar, you don't just say kufar for Jews and Christians. You say kufar for other Muslims who disagree with you, whoever you are. I can remember being in Malaysia when Anwar Ibrahim was deputy prime minister, doing great work. But on the other hand, for some of the Muslims there, if they heard him coming into a room, it was immediately kufar, kufar. So I think that this is an issue. We need to be honest. We need to compare our ideal to other religious ideals and our realities so that we can both address our realities. It's not enough to say, my religion is great because of the ideal. Let me tell you about your realities. We're still dealing in that world. And we write that way and we think that way. And it's only if we address those theologies and ideologies, secular fundamentalism, anti-immigration, these are all ideologies of hate that need to be addressed. We need to remember that, as was well pointed out, the West is a product of cross-civilization. Just as Islam learned from the West and then fed back to the West, okay? That process has gotten reversed in the 19th and 20th century. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. Initially, many Muslims didn't want to have anything to do with Western civilization, not realizing that it also had Islamic roots and that technology and science are there for all to learn from, to build on, and to move forward on. But we need to reinforce and work at that. We need to work towards a new synthesis. We need to recognize the realities of globalization, which have blurred the lines, as pointed out quite correctly. In our language, we have to talk about the Muslim world in the West, meaning Muslim countries in the West. But Islam is in the West, also. And so we have to realize that, again, our language has to somehow reflect the inclusiveness that exists in our societies, this new mosaic that exists, and therefore the need for a new convivencia. Well, how do we achieve that? And I'll be as brief as I can on this. I just love listening to myself. That's the problem. I should tell you, the last talk I gave this morning, they brought me on at 5 minutes to 12. Okay? And remember, at 12 o'clock, we had 2 minutes of silence. At 5 minutes to 12, there was an announcement that interrupted me, saying that in 3 minutes, we would get ready. In 2 minutes, not 3 minutes, they interrupted me again, and then immediately said, somehow the clock went fast, we'll now observe the 2 minutes. So I'm just going to get in this talk today, whether you like it or not. I don't care how hot you feel. Okay, so what are we engaged in? We're engaged in a dialogue of not just words, but of actions. A dialogue of words and actions, and that's really it. It's words and actions when we deal with each other, but it's also in terms of what you do as an audience. I say this to both Muslim and non-Muslim audiences, but when I do Muslim fundraisers, what I say to my Muslim friends for a long time is, it's not a matter of being, to use the American phrase, a couch potato. Couch potatoes like to sit there in their sports suits and watch sports. You see? They don't do. And many people like to talk about Chechnya, Palestine, the injustices of society, erosion of civil liberties, have dinner, and then go home and feel they're better than everybody else who doesn't talk about it. The fact is, what are we also doing? If we're not doing anything, the world isn't going to change. That dialogue has to be one that recognizes what Tariq talks about and other people, that in effect, we are now people of multiple identities. I'm not just Italian, I'm Italian-American. I'm not just Italian-American, I'm from Brooklyn. I'm not just Italian-American from Brooklyn, I'm more broadly American. I'm not just Italian-American from Brooklyn, more broadly, etc. I'm married to Jean, 41 years. I'm involved with Islam, etc. And the same thing is true, for Muslims. Thank God we're getting beyond that point when you had to deal with Muslims who came here, are here, and want to talk all the time about whether or not they really can be European or American, whether or not they should vote, whether or not. Why be here? You're creating a crisis of identity, not only for yourself, but for your children. And how are you going to then get your fellow citizens not to consider you as other if you're saying, in effect, I'm not making the connections? So this is what we all deal with. It's not that there aren't issues here with regard to assimilation and integration. We need to realize, as Tariq pointed to and was brought out before, that if we're going to use a word like pluralism or tolerance, even pluralism, it's got to be beyond the pluralism of the past. Many Muslim writers, from Egypt to Indonesia, from Europe to America, are talking about the fact that as enlightened as Dhimmi was in its time, that notion has to be broadened to embrace modern pluralism. It absolutely has to. And indeed, Muslims themselves in Europe and America ask for a different notion of what minority status is when it comes to how they are treated within those societies. We need to recognize that tolerance is not simply I suffer your existence. Tolerance means that I respect you. And you can't have respect without mutual understanding. Mutual understanding means that we understand each other. It doesn't mean that we agree with each other on everything. But it means that our understanding leads to respect. And respect means I respect your right to think differently than I do. What I want is the space to think and believe and follow my faith. You have the space to think and believe and follow your faith or follow no faith at all. And this is a challenge for many of us in light of our religious traditions and their development. They developed in different contexts. Roman Catholics grapple with this into the 1960s and 1970s. Many of your cardinals now that make statements about Islam not being pluralistic enough have a short historical memory. It's amazing. I would even argue probably some of them were fighting against this at the time of Vatican II. But all of a sudden, they now are born again, modern pluralists and tolerance. Let me end with the following observations, and these are probably the most important observations that I want to make. Number one, we have to stop the way in which elements in our communities engage in mutual Satanization, mutual demonization. You're extremists, you're kuffar. Once we have that language, that's it. You've got clash. There's no way around it. We have to fight that element in that language. And that's why, in an earlier session today, somebody said of Jamal Bedoui, well, this is a kind of intellectual, theological explanation of what the Quran really says about pluralism, etc. You don't get it. They don't get it when they say that. The fact is how people grow up and learn their faith, if they're going to be believers, affects how they're going to act. So if they're acting wrong now, the way you raise another generation is to get them to think correctly. We need to look at the realities of 9/11 and 7/7 and put those alongside our Guantanamos and our Abu Gharibs, etc. Both sides have to deal with the violations of human rights, the disrespect for life. And finally, we have to engage in a process, all communities, of self-criticism, one of the hardest things to do, of self-criticism, of mutual acceptance of responsibility for what we do, and accountability for what we do. Not that we say simply, you're responsible and accountable, and I'm simply a victim. The problem in this world is we all think we're victims. If we're not careful, it reminds me very much of what happens to some people when they first get married. Never happened in my marriage because I have a perfect marriage. And even later in marriage, when you have an argument and immediately the response is, you don't love me. You see? So it's obviously, I love you, you don't love me. 180 degrees, You're fully responsible for the argument. What we have to realize ultimately is that until all recognize, now it may be to different degrees, but until all recognize that they're part of the problem, they can't be part of the solution. They can simply not be part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for a very challenging and thought-provoking talk. Our next speaker is a man who believes in faith in action. He is a man of great courage and compassion. His convictions took him to the hotspot of Iraq, where he was held hostage for many months and released recently. He is Professor Norman Camber. He is 74. He is committed to peace activism. His kidnapping with 3 other colleagues in Iraq has stimulated the work of Christian peacemakers teams throughout the world. On behalf of the Cordoba Foundation, we are delighted that he could be with us today. He will be speaking about his experience. His talk will be aptly entitled From Captivity to Release, a View of Peacemaking. Please do give him a warm welcome.
So if you're going to see the screen, I'll have to sit down. So I hope that's all right. Here's the reason why I'm at Islam Expo. You'll see our friend Anas there, standing next to Bruce Kent, in fact, and that was one of the many vigils that was held in Trafalgar Square, but in cities all over this country and in other countries on behalf of us captives. Now, my trip to Iraq as a delegate with a Christian peacemaking team and the subsequent misadventure has had some very unexpected results. I went to meet Iraqis, something I largely failed to do. I've met more here, I think, than I've met I met in Iraq. And now I've also met SAS soldiers. I've met an ambassador. I met Fergal Keane, Ken Livingstone, and now this distinguished audience. Now, I'm somewhat awed at embarking on a religious topic in front of an audience with such authorities in the field. As a scientist, my area of research was bone growth, and I would be very happy to give you a lecture on that. The only other topic in which I'm probably the world's leading exponent is that of bath spotting. That is, taking photographs of baths in the countryside. That's the Sea of Galilee. And it's baths in the countryside are used as cattle troughs and plant pots and all sorts of things. and it's one of the topics on which I chose to try and relieve the boredom of my fellow captives during those they were a captive audience, of course, during those 3.5 months. Now, I'm sorry that my talk can have very little to do with the title, because I was debating what I was going to talk about. And my ideas were crystallised by an article in The Guardian, so you can see where I'm coming from, by Simon Jenkins. And it was an article about the current difficulties in the Anglican Church. But there were these sentences. Conflicts turn on religious disputes as much as on tribe, insecurity, and economic interest. It is a factor in most modern wars, and in many, religious fundamentalism and intolerance exacerbate rather than diminish the ferocity of conflict. And then he said this: I know of no religion that has successfully entrenched the maxim to love one's neighbour as oneself to political effect. And that's Simon Jenkins in The Guardian last week. Now, that's a sweeping statement, and we might consider that the humanitarian action after disasters and work in development aid, religions have extended the concept of neighbour from the local to the global. But on the issue of war, I fear he's largely correct. Atheists have a weapon to strike a mortal blow at us, and often use the argument that religion is a major cause of conflict in the world. It is therefore an issue that religions need to come to grips with in honest debate, and perhaps the Cordoba Foundation might like to take up the challenge, because it is such a repeated criticism of religious faith and belief. Now, even in my own experience, I came to Baghdad in peace. I went out with the SAS. Now, the SAS, the Special Air Services, are not a group known for their piety, but the captors who looked after us, they were regular in prayer and in reading and reciting the Quran. Now, I remember going some years ago to a course of lectures in Ealing, doesn't matter where it was, where representatives from the major faiths talked about their vision of peace. It was evident from each speaker that peace lay at the core of their professed religion, an essential element of its teaching explicit in their scriptures. Why then, I wondered, were there any wars at all in the world? In my own faith, love of enemies and the need to overcome evil by good is central to its teaching. But then, as you know, we probably have a bloodier history than most religions. From the time of Constantine, the Crusades, Catholic Protestant wars, colonial wars, up to Northern Ireland and so on, Christians have taken to armed force against their enemies. Even in Rwanda, that place of tragedy, majority of the population were Christian. What happened to teaching about loving your enemies? I don't know. Now, I remember that at those lectures, the representative of Buddhism gave a very pacific presentation, but when asked about conflict in Sri Lanka, responded that that was a political matter, not a religious one. And similar arguments were given by apologists of all faiths. It was religious, not political. Now, we revere Gandhi and Martin Luther King as exponents of non-violence, but normally it's argued that their victories were exceptional. But their achievements are just two examples of the many that are recorded in history. They're recorded in history, but not recorded, strangely, in the minds of Christians and peoples of other faiths. How many Muslims know who this gentleman is? Anyone? No hands up at all? None? This is Abdul Ghaffar Khan, sometimes known as Bashar Khan, who was the Gandhian who worked with Gandhi in the north of India. So Muslims should be proud of him. He was a non-violent victor. And the same is true of many other examples. This is a map of the world that I've used sometimes, and it just gives a few examples of non-violent victories. There's a guide to it, which I've used when I've talked about this before. But I mean, most of you should know about number 8, which is up in the north in Norway, where the Norwegian teachers successfully resisted the Quisling regime, Nazi regime. What about number 10, just down below it? Do you know about the wives of the Rosenstrasse? 6,000 of them in front of the army of Marcos, and because they were prepared to stay, keeping the revolutionary and the army apart for 3 days, they got Marcos deposed. Here are the mothers of the player De Mayo in Argentina, working silently for human rights in their country. And this is one that I rather like as a Baptist. In 1991, there was an attempted coup to overthrow Gorbachev, and here's a Baptist minister actually handing out scriptures to the tank crews, and that coup failed. So people of faith should hold these victories and cherish them, because they're great. They're, I think, what our faiths are all about non-violent victories. It's also necessary to emphasize it's not necessarily actually to have faith. They're perfectly good common sense reasons why non-violence should be practiced as much by atheists as anybody else. And we always remember that violence is the exception, since most conflicts are resolved without violence. There's a thing called the United Nations. I wish that more people believed in supporting it. Now, Tiananmen Square, that's to remind you, of course, that in many instances non-violence doesn't work. But I would argue that non-violence, even when it doesn't work, does not leave the legacy of hatred that violence does. So my main thesis is that we should come out of the captivity of the view that religion is only about personal peace, to use its teachings to release humankind from the curse of war. We need to sever the handcuffs that shackle religion to nationalism and allow it freedom to criticize power, whether it be military or economic or any other, or whatever oppresses men, women and children. I am, however, aware that the relationship between faith and nation varies from faith to faith, but resistance to oppression should be common to us all. Now, John Lederach, I think he's a Mennonite, he's recently written this. How do we transcend the cycles of violence that bewitch our human community while still living with them? We transcend violence. The transcending violence is forged by the capacity to generate, mobilize, and build what he calls the moral imagination. The moral imagination, it's the capacity, as other speakers have said, to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemies. It's a belief in the fundamental act, in the pursuit of the creative act, new ideas, new ways of solving problems, and acceptance of the inherent risk of stepping into the unknown that lies beyond the far too familiar landscape of violence. Now, sorry, I'll come to that in a moment. I really wonder why Christian thinkers, and I'm ashamed to say they do, why Christian thinkers prefer to extend the medieval theory of the just war to nuclear and preemptive strikes rather than use their moral imagination to extend ideas of non-violence. We know the Scandinavian countries have thought through non-violent resistance to invasion. Non-violent resistance to invasion. Why not Britain? So there we are. It is possible, if enough of us believe it, we can achieve non-violent solutions. Now, non-violent peacemaking may be costly. It may involve risks, but how much more costly is war? The Christian and Muslim peacemaker teams were founded on the simple idea that faith-based peacemakers should be prepared to take the same risks that young men and women do in serving in national armies. Now, are the people of faith willing to take up this challenge? Now, I finish with a final indulgence. This is my favourite picture of Italians celebrating my release, and I know that people of many faiths and nationalities did the same. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you, Dr. Kamba, for a very uplifting presentation about faith, peace, and courage. Let's press on. Our next speaker is Dr. Unaiza Muhammad. She's a representative of the Muslim Council of Britain, the UK's most representative Muslim body with over 400 affiliates comprising national, regional, and local organizations, mosques, charities, and schools. Dr. Unaiza Muhammad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. There is a story which is very well known in South Asia of the time when the great poet and philosopher Sir Allama Muhammad Iqbal stopped in Andalusia upon completion of his studies. And upon reaching Cordoba, he was so overcome by emotion that he cried until his shirt was wet. He has, in fact, written two very well-known poems about Masjid-e-Cordoba, and he speaks with great nostalgia about the time when people of all faiths rose above their petty rivalries and united in achieving what is recognized at the time of the flowering of knowledge. And it was the peace around them that allowed the great minds and the scholars of Cordoba, like Ibn Hazm, Ibn Rushd, and Maimonides, to flourish in that tolerant society. Tariq was talking about Ibn Rushd earlier, and I have to say that a lot of my Western friends who call him Averroes didn't even know that it was the same person as Ibn Rushd. But I'm here to speak on behalf of the Muslim Council of Britain, and I wish to tell you a little bit about it. The Muslim Council of Britain is an umbrella organization which is dedicated to the common good and the betterment of the community and this country that we all live in. It's been established since 1997, and we are very opposed to labels such as ethnic minority. We're British citizens with a very rich Islamic heritage who stand by all the responsibilities as citizens of this country. Our approach is to deal with civic affairs as one of participation, not agitation. In dealing with government, it is one of constructive engagement. And this means that the MCB strives to deal with problems, and it influences policies and outcomes through effective participation in conformity with our Islamic norms. I'd like to give you three brief examples of the work that the MCB do. The MCB we believe that what you can't measure, you cannot manage, and therefore we worked hard to secure the inclusion of the faith question on the last census to ensure that Muslims are identified by their faith rather than their race, and that information is made available in the public sphere for analysis in meeting the essential needs of the British citizens who are Muslims. Then the second example is that the MCB have completed a faith and employment project to raise the awareness of the law prohibiting religious discrimination in the workplace. And this involved us in producing a number of DVDs, publications, and so on, which were distributed for the guidance of employers and employees about Muslims in the workplace. Then, in order to promote a better understanding of Islam, MCB have launched a Books for School project where we've actually had to rewrite and produce our own textbooks, and which is a major initiative to ensure that Islam is presented in a fair and accurate manner in all the schools of this country. And I have to say, we've been fairly successful in that, and a number of the LEAs in this country have actually started to introduce those books in the curriculum. Now, the MCB has a very wide number of affiliations already, and on behalf of the MCB, I would like to congratulate the Cordoba Foundation, and especially its Chief Executive, Anas Al-Takriti. On behalf of the MCB, I pledge our firm support and cooperation in assisting with your aims wherever we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Unaiza. Now it's time for conclusion. On behalf of you, I wish the Cordoba Foundation the greatest success. And I'd like to make a few announcements. To know a bit more about the Cordoba Foundation's work, please do visit the exhibition stand that's in EK47 at the exhibition area. Please fill in and get involved with the work of the Cordoba Foundation and receive our mailing list. And for interviews and queries, please contact Mr. Abdullah Falaq sitting in the back. I'd like to make another announcement. There's an important panel taking part now on British Muslim youth and national identity. That's in West Hall. That's in the West Hall, so if you'd like to make your way to the West Hall. Thank you very much.
I think nationalism, there are good reasons to be distrustful. It has had a very traumatic history in Europe in the 20th century, which has caused many, many problems. But what I would say is that if one keeps the concept of the neighbour and the good neighbour, what do I owe with my neighbour, then one finds a path through this apparent contradiction that Wakas was talking about so eloquently. It seems to me that one doesn't have to have an unquestioning loyalty to the nation state an unquestioning nationalism, but one does have to have an understanding of how the national community is arbitrating the principles of good neighbourliness. And by that I mean obedience to the law, duty to the state, as in paying your taxes, as in keeping the law. And I would also say that alongside that, it's possible to develop a kind of patriotism. I would say I'm a kind of patriot. There are things about this country I love. I love London. I love many cultural aspects of Britain. Its pragmatism, its openness at times, its tolerance at times. But at all times, what is the most important principle is good neighbourliness. Now, when I was thinking about Ummah, I was thinking, I'm not sure I totally understand Ummah. And once again, as always happens when I hear Tariq speak, he helped open a new window. Because what he described as a definition of Ummah, to me, is radically new. Perhaps to you it's familiar, but the idea that the Ummah is a spiritual community, it's not an identity about who is Muslim and who is not Muslim. It's a spiritual community of all those who have a commitment to the kinds of common principles of good neighbourliness, of justice, of compassion, to bring about, to make that Ummah, that kingdom of heaven, real, not just an abstract concept, but something that is lived, that has an actual reality. So I find that so challenging about this particular moment in history, and this is my final point, is that good neighbourliness was once a very around the world. We have virtual neighbours. We know about the lives of people all over the world, whether they're Tibetan, whether they live in Darfur, whether they live in Palestine, and their suffering.
And this is second. I take offence personally because I, unlike some maybe in the audience, this is my country. When I feel homesick, it's because I am outside Britain for a lengthy period of time. I studied here, I grew up here, my childhood memories are in this country. I support teams from this country, although now I have to say that I do wish that France win the World Cup. But that, as I said, does not negate the fact that the question is being asked. And therefore we must address the question. However, with that question as to the question was asked, first and foremost from the Muslim community itself. We ourselves, our mosques at times, our leaders and scholars were sometimes addressing this issue as though this is a problematic area. And that, I feel, is where things started. And that is where I feel this issue was taken on board by those who wanted to exploit this further on the other side of the fence. And therefore, I always find it used, despite the fact that Salman al-Farisi came from an empire, from a civilization, if you wish, that was condemned by Islam, in fact condemning the Holy Quran. Yet still, he proudly declared himself as Salman al-Farisi. So it's vital that we feel as Muslims first and foremost. Then we enter into another quagmire. Because only a few weeks ago, when the World Cup started, we started debating what it meant to be British or what it meant to be English. And the radio show that I was listening to at the moment was absolutely hilarious. Because the fact of the matter is, there is no consensus on what this national identity means. And therefore I think that entering into this debate amongst ourselves of our own creation is extremely problematic about whether we're British, whether we're Muslim, and which comes before which. We can be both, we can be equally intrinsically, but Islam pushes us forward to behave, to act, to think, to stand, to support in a moral fashion, for principles, selflessly. That is our stand, and therefore we become better at being British. I'll try to wrap up in a minute or two. I think it's vital that one is loved for Islamic schools to have a wing in which it inserts through image, through fact, through statistics, the contribution of Muslims in modern day Britain. Not just the contribution towards Western civilization, but also what was our role in building British society, British industry, British manufacturing, and the such. My brothers and sisters, this is a question I have no doubt that it will be asked of us time and time and time again. Is evil and corrupt? Unless I do that question will always be problematic. When I do assert my Islam and my Britishness, that
the drinks and everything else, for all our students and everything else. So please take back the same in kindness by visiting the souk at their school and buying some, so we can continue to get the.
Well, I've got my three people. If you stand up, please. And if you stand up.
Talked a lot about loyalty to the Ummah, loyalty to Britain, loyalty to your principles. I'm concerned about one point that you did mention about targeting Islam. That's a very important point. And well, you know, when we talk about our loyalty to the Ummah, surely the Ummah of humanity, the brotherhood of humanity comes first before the Islamic Ummah, in the sense that we should be loyal to our humanity, all humans, first and foremost, before we're loyal, not before, but as an umbrella to the subcategory, which is the brotherhood of Muslims, in the sense that our anger and outrage about Iraq should be an anger at the human losses and not the Muslim losses. Our anger should be likewise for Rwanda atrocity, for all those areas across the world which have been conquered, invaded, attacked. And it should be an Islamic loyalty, Islamic patriotism. What do they come?
We'll take the next question. Inshallah, there'll be another round, and I will try to get as many of you as possible. If you all block the exits, the panelists can't get away, so they'll be here longer. Yeah?
I hate to bring this to attention, but since all the speeches were fantastic, especially Dr. Ramadan, however, we're good friends in fact. So apart from this, I want to point to the attention that I see a contradiction, despite everything, between what has been said now and the reality out there. I have in my hand a book I bought today, page 95 of this book, which is endorsed by most of the Saudi ulama, sold in several bookshops over there, including the one that monopolizes the region's Park mosques. It states in page 95 to praise the virtues of Christians and Jews and to criticize in any way the Muslims is an act of major kufr, disbelief. Secondly, we have in sale as well books by Abdullah Azhar, who, as we all perhaps know, or should know, was the intellectual mentor of Osama bin Laden. We also have discussions and nasheeds and things elegizing and praising the so-called Iraqi jihad and people like Zarqawi, openly calling him a hero and martyr of Islam, when in fact he mostly killed Muslims. And in this aspect, I think there was a dimension missing in the discussion, which is the growing problem of sectarianism that we're suffering as a backlash of Iraq here. And just to finalize, we have, even amongst the speakers, just yesterday, and he was recorded and presented in Al-Arabiya because of a statement in a discussion with me, Dr. Azam Tamimi, you say that the Palestinian suffering is such that there is a special dispensation to the Palestinian people to kill women and children included. There are no civilians. And I ask, is it ever justifiable, according to the Sharia, to kill women and children of whatever faith, of whatever aspect, no matter what oppression? Since when is Sharia or teacher?
I just want to first say I very much like what Dr. Farah said about universal principles. Very good statement about that. In terms of the discussion now about being a British Muslim, I think everyone's in agreement with what Anna said about everyone now coming to the conclusion that you can be British and be Muslim. And it's almost that we're repeating the same argument over and over. But in terms of dealing with it pragmatically and practically, if you look and see the typical practicing Muslim, if you like, where they will direct their energies, it's usually within, say, Muslim organizations, or generally people who are very practicing. Majority of their friends are Muslim, and very little do you see people getting involved in British organizations, general causes of humanitarian work, helping refugees, looking after the environment, local community organizations. In terms of the culture of the British culture, a lot of it is seen as un-Islamic, going into theatre or music and all these kind of things. So from a practical perspective, are we really fulfilling this idea of being a British Muslim? Is it in reality very difficult because a lot of it is incompatible? So if you can just comment about that.
Okay, thank you. Let's hear the panelists and then inshallah I'll come back for another 3 questions. The first one, if I can ask on us to start off with this is about
I'll address the final comments regarding whether we are involved sufficiently or enough in activities.
And that's not the question. No? The question was from the sister here about. Yes. I'd like it.
So the question was?
The question was about do we have allegiance or do we think about humans and their suffering first, or is it Muslims?
I always have a problem when I'm asked to put things in order. What comes before what? I always have a problem with that. And I don't think that it's a fair proposition to demand of the panel or the Muslim community or this audience to set in order, number 1, 2 and 3, who we should care for. I think that when we care for, I think that I agree entirely. In fact, I had it put down before Madeline drew my attention to the fact that Tariq had said about the notion of the Ummah. The thing that I wanted to say was that I saw the Ummah as a set of values, as people who agreed on a set of values. And I think that we share that and we agree on basically the principle of al-Ukhuwat al-Insaniyya. I think we agree on that. And that is asserted by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, by the Holy Quran, by the scriptures. Amongst that, and this is something that allow me to be a little bit passionate about this, or over-passionate about this possibly. Because I am all for the fact that we as Muslims must defend all those who come under or subject to injustice. Everyone, whether in Britain, across Europe, or anywhere in the world. But we have to also realize that often when people say this, they are running away as though from defending the rights of the people in Palestine or Iraq. We must never do so. Why should I be ashamed to say that I am here standing for the rights of the Palestinians, or the Iraqis, or the Afghans, simply because of the situation that is there? Look at the 5 most popular issues in every news bulletin, anywhere in the world. All of them. Iraq, Palestine, Afghanistan, Darfur, Somalia. Whether I like it or not, and I hate it. Honestly, I hate it. The 5 most popular issues around the world are issues of protecting Muslims. It is a fact that we as Muslims, we must support those who come under injustice, whether here or abroad, regardless of their faith, ethnicity, or creed. We don't need to go over the thing that is in no way to distance us from our obligation. Simply because of who we are, our context, our imagination, our memory, our consciousness, to bring to the fore the causes of Palestine.
Two things. The first one to Anna. I totally understand where you're coming from. The only thing is that I think there can be a slightly distorted way of looking at it. We live in a broken world, in a world full of terrible suffering. But it's not just suffering experienced by Muslims. And the sad reality is that suffering we hear about in Iraq and Afghanistan is happening in many other parts of the world, and we don't even know about it. Look at the Congo, one of the worst civil wars.
The halls will be closing in 15 minutes.
And the question I return to you, because obviously I'm horrified what you read out in that book. I personally am horrified.
what do you engage your critical mind when you read that? Is that your understanding of Islam? And if it is not, why do you buy the book? Why do you read it? And if it is, we've got a little conversation to have.
Very quickly, because the starting question is really interesting for all the other questions. The first one, which is about...
Your attention, please. The show will be closing in 15 minutes at 7 p.m. The show will be closing in 15 minutes at 7 p.m. Thank you.
Okay. So, I think that if you are clear about the fact that there is spirituality and a set of principles. If you belong to this, there is no contradiction between, humanity and the Ummah. If you belong to this, I think the decision that we have to choose is the problem. If these principles are universal, out of this, what you are doing for humanity is done also at the same time in the name of your belonging to these kind of principles. So to serve the people, to criticize enemies are Muslim. In fact, the real Islamic teaching is not what is the identity of the enemy. It's why are we going to this war? Is it just or unjust? If the enemies are unjust Muslims, you have to stand up in the name of justice. And if they are just non-Muslims, sometimes the people are asking you questions or putting questions, the way they are putting them are misleading. You have to rebuild, rephrase, translate the question in something which is really right. All the discussion about who are you first is a complex question, is a stupid question. Is in this country also to ask for more consistency. At the end, we British citizens are trying to reform this society for the better. And this should be done at the local level. This should be done not only, I totally agree, the international issues are important. But what about the election issue? What about discrimination in this country? What about education in this country? This is what we have to be involved and committed within this society. The last point, and this is really important, it's a very essential question that you ask. You are all speaking here about something which is the Islamic message that we believe in. You know, as I know, everyone here knows that we have other discourses.
Of a political ummah, of a ummah that is trying to deter those who want to subdue it and who have been trying to subdue us for the past 3 centuries. Read history and you will see for yourself. And then, just a word in the memory of the great Shaheed Abdullah Azzam. I'm not going to defend myself, but Shaheed Abdullah Azzam, the person who spoke against Shaheed Abdullah Azzam, I bet you has never read any of his writings. And I challenge him to get something out of the writings of Abdullah Azzam that says anything that supports takfir or the killing of other Muslims. Never. I have the entire works of Abdullah Azzam. I have studied them all from volume 1 to the last volume. He's always been warning, he was always warning the takfiri jama'at that it is not allowed under any circumstance to kill an innocent person. So to distort his image like this using Zionist propaganda is most immoral. Thank you very much.
I hope the sister doesn't feel now under pressure to meet up to the expectations of the last question there.
Assalamu alaikum. Basically, it's just to follow on from what Anas said, and basically what I find more insulting than being asked whether I'm Muslim or British first is, the media, publicizing, Muslims as being terrorists, calling it, Islamic terrorism, Islamic extremism, when Islam has nothing to do with those sort of acts, justify our beliefs because of what, individuals are doing around the world.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Suhail Al-Zawi. I'm an architect. 2 days ago, we've been challenged by our Prime Minister. He said that there is no difference, that there is no such thing as Western ideology being wrong in the Muslim world. I think it is the duty of all Muslims, whether in this country or abroad, particularly the leaders, to say, Prime Minister, you are wrong, because there is a difference. Our countries have been actually occupied for many centuries. Palestine was given away in 1917 without consultation with the Palestinians. The Balfour Declaration. The Arabs actually fought with the Allies in 1914 to 1918, sadly against our brothers, the Ottomans. And yet, the Arab countries were subdivided like sheep between the Allies. And I think what we should do is to say, on us as a community, that there are certain principles which are dictated in the Quran and in the Sunnah that we cannot actually avoid from preaching them. And if the Prime Minister doesn't agree with them, then it is up to him to raise this level to our own. It is not for us to lower our standards. And therefore, if you kill someone by airplanes, it's exactly the same thing as giving the gun in the face of that person. Because you do not see the people you are killing by planes and by missiles, it does not mean that you are not committing a crime against humanity.
Okay. Thank you. I think there's really two questions there, and I'll ask the panelists to comment on those. The last one was more of a statement. So, if I start with Madeleine, about the real issue being the foreign policy, as Dr. Hazan Thamimi raised, and Tony Blair's comment, and if you want to comment about the spiritual, because you raised it after Tariq's presentation, the concept of spiritual ummah. And also the second question was about Islamic terrorism, using terminology like Islamic terrorists.
Right. Well, I'm probably going to say something that won't get any applause. No, I don't think there's going to be any applause on this. As much as I very much enjoy talking to Azam at all times, I disagree with him on this one. I think that if I can say to both Azam and the sister here, that I'm afraid there are good reasons why you are questioned about as Muslims, about your loyalty in a way that I'm not now being questioned as a Catholic. Nobody says to me, are you Catholic or British first? The problem is, and the IRA is a very interesting contrast, so I think that's absolutely right to bring it in. The problem is that we have a form of terrorism which draws its inspiration from Islam, from its faith. And I think that is why
Islam Expo is closed for today. Islam Expo is closed for today. Would all visitors please make their way to the nearest exits? Thank you.
The question is, what do you have faith in more? What the announcer said or what the reality is here? Until we leave, it's not finished. So carry on.
I feel like every time I try and say, are Muslims getting too involved in Muslim organisations? I think that's a really good question, and I'd like to sort of hear lots more people talking about that, because I think that in the kind of evolution and the development of the Muslim community that I've seen over the last decade, there's an incredible growth of organisations, of engagement, of activism.
You have to speculate, you have to reach out. The demand of the Muslim community to build the bridge all the way through is a question too much. I fear that the vast majority of Muslims, I don't even agree with the time saying that just 87% are against those who carried out the ones. I think they go beyond the 95%. So never mind. The vast majority of Muslims, they are people who feel that engaged in this for more than 20 years now. going across mosques up and down the country, winning over. I and my friends were winning the war on terror. We were winning the war on extremism. We were getting there. I know people who wanted to go and join the Taliban, and they came to me and they said, by the way, my introduction, we need to give ownership to the youth. And that means we listen to them, and we often, I'm not saying all the time, but we often implement some of their ideas. Extremism feeds off one principle, and that principle is there is no way you can change things apart from. That is what they feed off from. We need to prove them wrong, and we prove them wrong by changing our ways. And I'm talking not only about the Muslim community, I'm talking about government policies at home and abroad. That way, we'll be able to start that.
The doors are closing.
How do you think right now?